So first of all, thank you, Mark, for that very informative talk and for particularly providing such great examples of shared value, because I think that really helps to solidify the concept for many of us. We have some time for some questions, and just as a reminder, if you can use your microphones and identify yourself and your affiliation, that would be terrific. I'm going to try to help organize this thing, but
okay.
You're the man of the hour. So.
No.
Hello, Mark.
Yes.
This is Clarion Johnson.
Yes,
I have
Clarion.
a question for you.
Yes.
When you go visit a site, irrespective of irrespective of what sort of an organization it is, whether it's an NGO or a business, who do you want in the room to listen to you? Who is going to be most capable of carrying out what your insights or perspectives are on that particular organization?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I need the CEO, because this really is about shifting the organizational strategy, whether it is a company or an NGO. And unless there is permission to do that from the top, it's very, very hard to make it happen, because this involves expenditures of capital, and it involves risk by undertaking activities and efforts for new markets, new ways of working that the organization hasn't dealt with before. So you need permission from the top. But I also need the operating people in the organization at each level, because they're the ones who see the opportunities on the ground, who understand what the capabilities of the company is in order to actually develop shared value initiatives and efforts. And so we see it at a couple different levels that we need to engage people.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was terrific, and as you said, Brenda, those practical examples really bring it to life. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing around shifts of thinking in shareholders and investors. So yes, you talk about internally in CEOs and that drive, but are you seeing sort of a more enlightened, demanding sort of shareholder voice that's more conducive to shared value rather than just maximizing the return?
Yeah, that's a great question, Simon. And of course, CEOs and companies only have permission to embrace shared value to the extent shareholders understand it. We are beginning to see a little bit of movement there. I wish I could say it was a strong wave of change. It is not yet. It is the beginning edge of change. But there is a shift. Part of the challenge is that the investment community tends to go back to thinking about socially responsible investing. And a tremendous amount of assets, about a quarter of assets globally, almost half of assets in Europe, are invested with some socially responsible investing lens. The problem is socially responsible investing is really about doing no harm. It is about avoiding bad industries or companies that do bad things. And sometimes it is about things like whether companies do business with repressive regimes like Iran, which honestly is not the biggest social impact any company has, nor the social issue that has the biggest business benefit to them. So it's often not really very well aligned with the economic performance of the company. And so when you look at the returns of socially responsible investing, you don't see any particular benefit there. What you need is a lens that says, is the company actually doing something about social issues in a way that improves their own economic performance? Because that's shared value. And very few investors have yet gotten to that level of sophistication. There are a few who have, and there is some emerging evidence that they've actually outperformed the market and their peers by doing that. But as I say, it's still very early yet. Yes, Paula. Oh, I'm sorry, not Paula. Paula.
Hi, I'm Purvi Bhatt from Medtronic Philanthropy, and great comments, Mark, and always learn so much from the variety of examples that you have. You know, I have to reflect that I just arrived from Geneva, where there have been a lot of conversations around conflict of interest and how we navigate waters when we're thinking through the very real issues around public-private partnership. Would love some examples on how the shared value dialogue has been navigated on the government side, because no matter what we do, especially in these emerging markets, and particularly with the underserved, we are still in the backdrop of a government responsibility. And so some examples from that end, I think would be really beneficial, because it's that P that sometimes we've got to work
Yeah.
on as well. So
Yeah.
thanks for that.
I think there are a lot of challenges on the government side. In some countries, of course, corruption is a huge challenge, and it is very hard to get shared value off the ground in that context. Sometimes we've seen companies be able to influence government because of the leverage and clout that they have. And so, for example, when Yara worked on developing that agricultural corridor, they had to deal with issues of government corruption. It turned out it took more than 6 months for something to get through the port, and that was a corruption issue. They were able to marshal enough of the private enterprises to force change, because you can't sell fertilizer if it takes 6 months to get it to the crop. So I think that there is a role of companies in exerting leverage that NGOs often don't have to get government to pay attention and make changes. I think there are also very positive examples of government investing in innovation that then spurs shared value opportunities. There's a project called Grand Challenges Canada, which is a venture capital undertaking funded by the government, that is looking explicitly at shared value innovations, many of them in health, with the idea that they can fund the early stages of companies and then bring those companies in to be acquired by larger multinationals so that they can get to scale quickly. And they have a very interesting track record. There's a strong case to be made that if companies are actually improving outcomes in health and education and income, government should subsidize this, should help defray some of the risk, should create tax and other incentives for companies to undertake these things, because in the end of the day, it saves government money. We haven't seen a lot of that happen yet, and I think, again, there are issues, as India ran into, about how do you define the policies so that you can distinguish between something that is an innovative shared value effort beyond business as usual and just the traditional investment that the company makes anyway. But I think we are beginning to see it. And I think we're beginning to see it with foundations as well. There's a fascinating example to me where Gates Foundation was interested in improving the incomes of smallholder farmers in South Africa. Coca-Cola wanted to sell juices in South Africa, but it was too expensive to import the pulp, and so they wanted it grown locally. But there was a huge transition cost for farmers to switch their crops to learn how to grow fruit instead of sorghum or whatever they were growing before, and a delay before they had a harvest where they could realize an income. And so Gates funded the transition costs, because it turned out it wouldn't have met the hurdle rate for investment for Coca-Cola to use their own funds. But then Coke agreed to buy the fruit once the transition was achieved. And on the one hand, you look at this and say, this is crazy. One of the richest foundations in the world is funding one of the richest corporations in the world. Why would you do that? And on the other hand, you say it's a perfect fit, where Gates wants to help farmers without them being dependent on the foundation's support in the long term. And Coke is willing to make an investment for a new business, but only if it satisfies the return on investment that their shareholders expect. And so this way of thinking is, I think, a great example of what public-private partnerships can look like for shared value.
Actually, I have a question.
Yes. Yes.
I think I'm allowed to ask. So just expanding on that a little bit, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on WHO and their potential acceptance of this concept. This is something that came up yesterday during our forum meeting. The challenge that some of us see in having WHO be willing to collaborate with us if they know that there is a commercial opportunity for the company as well. So I'd be curious to know if you've had any experience with that or any perspective on how we could get WHO on board as well.
A nice, easy question. Thank you.
That's my job.
Look, this is one of the issues, and it's not just WHO, it's the UN, it is many development agencies around the world from different countries who have always believe that the way to achieve social progress is to work through government, and that private enterprise is not to be trusted. And of course, it's not just a sort of policy thing. It's about the people who work in these organizations who don't typically come out of a private sector background and who may not understand business in all of its complexity and good and bad. And again, they're not entirely wrong. You know, there are companies like VW that make my job going around talking about shared value very difficult. And there are plenty of others. You know, Coca-Cola was recently, the New York Times had articles about them funding research and a nonprofit that was basically a front that they funded to promote the idea that the problem is people aren't getting enough exercise, not that they're drinking sugary drinks. There are incentives, unfortunately, for companies to act badly. It turns out those tend to be very short-term incentives, and those don't work well in the long term. And part of what's going on, and this goes back to Simon's question about investors, is a need to get companies to think more in the long term, not just quarter to quarter. And that, again, ties into many things. But I think to come back to the WHO issue and so on, I think, again, companies are partly to blame because they are not always acting responsibly, and the suspicion with which they're treated is understandable. But I would say the reward for getting this right, for public-private partnerships that really engage companies in what they can do well to solve problems and engage the expertise and resources and influence of international aid agencies and groups like the WHO, the opportunity there is so great that I think people are beginning to be open to it. But there's also a tremendous need for people who have experience across sectors, who have worked in private enterprise, who have worked in international development, who have worked in NGOs, and understand all three perspectives and all three different languages. And again, we're beginning to see more people moving across sectors like that, and I think that too is a tremendously important element of the change that's necessary. I will say the International Aid Organization of Australia, AusAid, just a couple of months ago announced that shared value is going to be the framework that they use to engage private enterprise. And have created a whole document around what that means and how they're going to relate differently to private enterprise because of it. So I do see this shift happening, but it is a cultural shift within organizations that is not easy. Yes, sir.
Hi. Steve Sunderland, Peace Village Cancer Project, Cincinnati, Ohio. I hope you're right. I hope you're right about every aspect of what you're saying. I hope that there is an opportunity for shared values. I don't see much of that going on in our city of Cincinnati. We see more gentrification led by business, segregation of our neighborhoods, and we see greater mortality amongst our minorities in the area of cancer, especially, with the private sector sitting on the sidelines. We don't see the kind of, when you say shared value, I think we in the community look at that with great suspicion, as you've indicated, not only because of Volkswagen, but we can just see it in the practices of our own city and the way in which our government and our private sector work. So the question is, can there be shared values if there's no sharing at the table when these discussions are taking place? If you're doing research on us, so to speak, but we're not really a part of that research, if you're making policies about us, but we're not really a part of that, and if you're looking at outcomes without really evaluating where we are in that process, then what's really being shared is just another form of exploitation. And that's what we are really afraid of. We see a great income inequality expanding in our city as well as in the world. We see all these other patterns going on, and we see society basically saying it's really too big a problem for us to work on. So when we have to work on it, we have to work on it within the community, within very limited resources, and without shared values, if you will. So in our particular city, I would sum up by saying, again, appreciating your talk, I really hope some people eventually, Mark Twain said it takes 25 years for ideas to really catch on in Cincinnati. I hope it happens a little bit sooner in that regard, because our mortality of African Americans and low-income people is the highest in the state of Ohio.
Yeah.
And it has to change.
Yeah.
But it won't change only because we want it to change. It has to really be part of a
Right.
process.
And, I'm living in San Francisco now, where the inequity and gentrification is even greater. There is a whole piece around shared value and equity, and what it means to really take into account the needs of different populations and non-traditional customer groups that we are just beginning to explore with a national group called Policy Link. And I think that, I will also say, shared value is still a relatively new idea, as you say. There are some leading companies absolutely embracing it, and many that are not yet there. I do think that there is hope, because these lower-income populations are viable customer groups, not for the traditional product in the traditional way it was sold, but for new products and new ways of financing and selling solutions. And organizations that begin to meet these needs will grow and thrive, and that will be a useful example. We haven't solved this problem through philanthropy or through government in the past decades. And while I don't know that shared value and engaging business differently will necessarily be the panacea, I think it is a new step that can be helpful. Ultimately, the role of government cannot be replaced. And if we have government policy that favors gentrification, that favors those who are wealthiest, it's going to be very hard for companies through shared value to offset that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we may have time for only one more question. Okay. Ben, I think you had your... Sorry, Dick.
Yeah, am I on?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Ben Hoffman, I'm with GE. It looks like we're entering a prolonged period of low energy prices. How do you think that's going to, the net impact of that upon sovereign spending, upon corporate investment, that type of thing, which has been a big piece of the ability to spend?
Yeah, I think, obviously, truck sales are up and small car sales are down, and a lot of funds that were going into solar and alternative energy are not going there as quickly because of low energy prices. And certainly, some of the sovereign nations that have depended on oil revenue are being challenged to think about what their future looks like. Ultimately, I think that it slows things down when fossil fuels are inexpensive. It slows down the incentives for change. There was an interesting New Yorker column just last week about how, on the one hand, Obama and the government has come out regulating against coal, and on the other hand, one of the richest coal deposits in the country in Colorado is owned by the government and is being made available to coal companies at massive discounts from market prices, so that there's basically a $3 billion subsidy by the federal government to coal companies to make coal less expensive, at the same time that the government is trying to get rid of coal. And so I think, the notion of, can we create a consistent set of policies here that favor alternative energy, that favor a move toward a reduction in carbon emissions, is very powerful. And there are lots of subsidies for oil and gas, which could change that equation very quickly, I believe, if they were removed as well. Thank you very much for letting me be here this morning. Again, I think I'm so excited by this conference and this topic. Thank you. Thank you.